Judson Pike did not knock. He rode his horse straight up to the fence line of Elias Boone's property on a Tuesday morning in March, while Elias was still in the barn, trying to patch a roof beam that had cracked overnight. And he sat there in the saddle, like he owned every inch of ground his shadow touched. He had two of his ranch hands with him, big men, the kind who got paid to stand behind someone and not say anything. Judson pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it out without getting down from his horse. "Tell Boone he's got 30 days, Judson said to little Clara, who had come out to see what the noise was. She was 12 years old, and she stood in the mud in front of the house with her arms crossed. "Tell him the bank and I had a real productive conversation yesterday. Tell him the smart thing to do is take what I'm offering and stop making his children suffer for his pride." Clara did not take the paper. Judson leaned down and dropped it in the mud at her feet. Then he turned his horse around and rode back down the road, without another word. If this story already has your heart beating a little faster, you are exactly who this channel is made for. We tell stories about ordinary people who refuse to break when everything is stacked against them. Subscribe right now so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels before it's done. Now, let's go back to where this all began. Elias Boone had not slept well in 4 months. That was not an exaggeration, and it was not self-pity. It was just a fact. The same way it was a fact that the north fence needed 3 new posts, that the well pump groaned every morning before it decided to cooperate, and that he owed the Dustfield Savings and Loan $460 that he did not have. Sleep had become something that happened to other people. Elias would lie down after the children were in bed, stare at the ceiling with its water stain, shaped vaguely like the state of Missouri, and run numbers in his head until the numbers stopped making sense, and exhaustion finally dragged him under, somewhere around 2 in the morning. He was 41 years old, and he looked on his worst days like a man pushing 50. His wife Margaret had died 3 winters ago. Fever. It had come fast, and it had not given either of them time to say the things that needed saying. And Elias had spent a long time afterward being angry at that particular cruelty. He had 3 children to raise, a ranch that had never been more than marginal, and a stubbornness that his own mother had once described as his finest quality and his worst flaw in the same sentence. The children had learned to read his moods the way farmers read weather. When Elias came in from the fields rubbing the back of his neck, that meant money trouble. When he went quiet at the supper table, that meant the money trouble was getting worse. Clara, the oldest, had started keeping a little notebook where she wrote down everything the family spent, because she had heard her father mutter about accounts, often enough that she understood, in the way children understand things they are too young to fully carry, that numbers mattered desperately in this house. Samuel was 9 and mostly concerned with the horses and whether the mud in the yard was deep enough to lose a boot in. Rose was 6 and still reached for her mother, sometimes in her sleep, still called out a name that was no longer there to answer, and Elias would sit on the edge of her bed in the dark and wait until she settled back into whatever dream had taken her somewhere safer. This was the life he had. It was not a bad life. He needed to believe that, even on the mornings when the pump groaned and the fence sagged and the numbers in his head refused to balance. It was not a bad life. It was just a hard one. The advertisement had been Clara's idea originally. She had read about it in one of the old newspapers that a neighbor woman had passed along, folded into the middle pages like something slightly shameful. Women of means and education seeking honest frontier husbands. Reputable agency. Correspondence conducted with full discretion. Clara had torn out the page and left it on the kitchen table without saying anything, and Elias had stared at it for 3 days before he finally sat down and wrote a letter that he rewrote 7 times before he sent it. He had been honest in the letter, painfully honest. He had described the ranch as it was the leaking barn, the unfinished back room, the debts, the 3 children, the fact that there was no luxury here and no pretense of any. He had described himself the same way. A widower, 41, not educated beyond what a one-room schoolhouse could provide, not wealthy, not heading toward wealthy anytime soon. He had written, "I am not a man who can offer a woman comfort or ease. I can offer honesty, steady work, and 3 children who need a steady hand more than they need anything else in this world." He had half expected no response. The response had come from a woman named Vivienne Harcourt of St. Louis, Missouri. Her letters were written in a clear, precise hand that told him immediately she had been educated somewhere expensive. She did not write the way women in the agency advertisements wrote, all softness and domestic promise. She wrote like someone reporting facts. She was 34 years old. She had spent the previous 12 years managing the household accounts and eventually the business correspondence of her late father's textile import firm, which she had helped keep solvent through 2 financial panics before her older brother had inherited it and immediately run it nearly into the ground through a combination of arrogance and bad investment. She had money of her own, a modest inheritance from a maternal aunt, but she had no particular interest in spending it on Saint Louis society functions and no patience left odd for a life that had begun to feel like it was happening to someone else. She had written, "I am not looking for a rescue, and I am not looking for a pleasant arrangement. I am looking for a life that requires something real from me. If your situation is as difficult as you describe, then it sounds like a place where that might be possible." Elias had read that letter 4 times. He had written back and told her she should understand what she was agreeing to. She had written back and told him she had understood his first letter perfectly well and did not require it repeated. They had exchanged 9 letters over 2 months. Then she had written to say she was taking the train west in 3 weeks. Elias had spent those 3 weeks convincing himself this was a catastrophic mistake. By the time he was standing on the platform at Dustfield Station, on the morning the train was due, he had worked himself into a thorough certainty that Vivienne Harcourt was going to step off that train, take one look at him, and the broken wagon he had managed to get the wheels back on only the previous afternoon, and get right back on and ride east before the locomotive had finished taking on water. He had dressed carefully, which for Elias meant his least-patched shirt and the hat that did not have the sweat stain on the front brim. Samuel was beside him, fidgeting with his suspenders. Clara stood very straight and still, which was how she handled situations that made her nervous. Little Rose was holding Elias's hand with both of hers, which she only did when she was uncertain about something. The platform was not crowded. Dustfield was not a town that generated much passenger traffic. There was a station master, who was also the ticket seller and the man who loaded freight. And there was an older woman named Hattie Pierce, who had driven in from her property 3 miles east specifically to see what the Boone mail-order bride looked like. Hattie was not subtle about this. She had brought a folding chair. The train arrived 7 minutes late. The passengers who got off were a traveling goods salesman with 2 heavy sample cases, a young man in a new suit who looked like he was coming home to someone's disapproval, and a woman. Elias knew immediately which one was Vivienne Harcourt. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, or rather, she was striking in a way that was different from beautiful. She was a tall woman, solidly built, with dark hair pinned up under a traveling hat that had probably cost more than Elias's wagon. Her dress was deep green, the kind of fabric that did not exist in Dustfield except on special occasions. She carried herself with the careful, upright posture of a woman who had spent years in rooms full of people who were watching her, and had decided not to give any of them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She stepped off the train and looked at the platform. Then she looked at Elias. He raised one hand in something that was neither a wave nor a greeting, but a sort of helpless acknowledgement of his own existence. She walked toward him with 2 pieces of luggage, being carried by the conductor behind her. Each piece of luggage was finer than anything Elias owned that was not alive. "Mr. Boone," she said. "Miss Harcourt." He took off his hat. "Ma'am, I welcome to Dustfield." She looked at the town behind him. The main street, the feed store, the 3 buildings that needed paint, the wagon with the wheel that was still slightly crooked, despite his best efforts. "Your letters were accurate," she said. He braced himself. "I did try to be straight with you." "You were." She looked at the children. "These are yours." "Yes, ma'am. Clara, Samuel, and the little one is Rose." Vivienne crouched down, right there on the platform in her fine green dress, and looked at Rose directly. Rose stared back with the expression she used for things she had not decided about yet. "Hello, Rose," Vivienne said. Rose said nothing. "That's all right," Vivienne said. "I'm not in a hurry." She straightened up and looked at the wagon. "Is the wheel going to hold?" she asked. Elias cleared his throat. "It should. I worked on it yesterday." "Should," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She considered this. "Well, better than probably." Hattie Pierce, from her folding chair 15 feet away, did not even pretend she wasn't watching. Vivienne glanced at her once, gave her a brief, neutral nod, and turned back to Elias. "Should we go?" Vivienne said. They loaded her luggage into the wagon. Took some rearranging, because there was more of it than Elias had anticipated, and one of the cases was quite heavy. He didn't ask what was in it. He found out later that it contained books, ledgers, and a set of accounting tools, including a small mechanical adding device that Clara would spend the next 3 days trying to understand. The ride back to the ranch was 40 minutes of Elias trying to think of things to say and coming up mostly empty, while Samuel asked Vivienne 11 questions about St. Louis without pausing long enough for her to answer most of them, and Clara sat in the back with a dignity that was almost painful to watch. And Rose kept her eyes on Vivienne with an expression that was approximately 1/3 curiosity and 2/3 wariness. Vivienne answered the questions she could catch. She had a dry, direct way of speaking that was not unkind but was not soft either. When Samuel asked if she had ever seen a real theater, she said yes. When he asked if she had seen anything with explosions, she thought about it and said she had once attended a fireworks display that had gone somewhat sideways, which had involved a great deal of smoke and one very surprised horse. Samuel laughed. Clara did not, but her expression shifted slightly, which was the same thing. When they turned the last bend in the road and the ranch came into view, Elias watched Vivienne's face. She looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. It was not an impressive sight. The main house was standing and solid at its bones, but the back portion that Elias had been framing out for 2 years was still just raw lumber and no roof. The barn had a sag on the left side where the support beam was failing. The fence lines were functional, but they had the look of something maintained by necessity rather than care. The fields to the east were fallow and brown. The back of the house, Elias started. How long has the barn beam been like that?" she said. He blinked. "Which one?" "The one on the left support. You can see the lean from here." He looked at it. "Since last fall. I've been shoring it up with. It needs to be replaced, not shored." She said it the way she would say the sky was blue. No accusation. Just yes, he said, "I know." They pulled up to the house. Elias helped her down from the wagon, and she stood in the yard for a moment, looking around at everything with those steady, observational eyes, and he waited for the verdict. For the moment when she would say something polite and final and ask him how soon the next train east ran. Instead, she said, "Where do you want me to start?" Stared at her. "I what? I've been sitting for 2 days on trains," she said. "Where would I be most useful right now? The house, the accounts, or something else?" Elias opened his mouth and closed it again. "The accounts," Clara said quietly from behind them. Vivienne turned and looked at Clara with an expression that was the closest thing to warmth she had shown since stepping off the train. "Then show me where they are," she said. That was the first hour. By the end of the first day, Elias understood that something had arrived at his ranch that he did not have a proper name for yet. Vivienne did not tour the property and make suggestions. She asked him specific questions: costs, yields, what he owed, and to whom and on what schedule, with the focused attention of someone who had done this kind of work before and was not doing it to be polite. She sat at the kitchen table with Clara beside her and went through the ledgers that Elias kept in a battered box under the bed, and Elias, standing in the doorway watching, had the strange experience of seeing his own financial life laid out and examined by someone who was not panicking at what they found. "You're not as far under as you think you are," Vivienne said, after about an hour. Elias came into the room. "I've got $460 owed to the bank." "I know what you owe the bank. I mean, the ranch itself isn't as broken as you're treating it. You're surviving emergency by emergency. That's not the same as failing." "It feels like failing." She looked up at him. "I'm sure it does. But feeling and fact are different things, Mr. Boone. You've got cattle, you've got land, and you've got a daughter who can already read a ledger better than some men I've worked for." Clara kept her eyes on the table, but her ears went red. "What's that field to the east been growing?" Vivienne asked. "Nothing. Last 2 seasons, the cattle grass there came in poor. It's not good grazing. Has anyone tried wheat?" Elias looked at her. "This is cattle country. Cattle country is what the men who've been here 30 years call it, because that's what they've always done." She closed the ledger. The soil to the east looked different coming in. Drier on top, but there's clay underneath holding moisture. Wheat might take if you got the seed in right. "I don't know anything about wheat farming." "No," she agreed. But I've read about it, and I've got money for seed, and I suspect you've got a strong back and a willingness to try something that might not work." Elias pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He had not been spoken to like this, like a capable man being offered a reasonable proposition, rather than a charity case, in longer than he could easily remember. "What exactly are you proposing?" he said. "I'm proposing we look at this ranch as something that can be fixed, rather than something we're holding together while it falls apart." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm not here to give you money, Mr. Boone. I've got some, and I'm willing to put it towards something that makes sense. But money without a plan just delays the same problem. We need a plan. You've been here 8 hours," he said. "I've been reading your situation in letters for 2 months," she said. "I've had time to think." He sat with that for a moment. "The bank loan is the immediate problem," he said. "The bank loan is a symptom. The cattle operation is undercapitalized, and you're carrying too many head for what the grazing can support in a dry year." She opened one of the ledgers again and turned it toward him. "If you sell 20% of the herd now, while prices are decent, you free up grazing for the rest, you reduce your feed costs, and you generate enough cash to restructure the bank payment onto a schedule you can actually maintain." "Judson Pike has been after me to sell," Elias said. The name came out with a particular weight. "Judson Pike," Vivienne repeated. "The neighbor to the north. He wants the property. Has for years. He's been buying up the smaller ranches one by one when the owners can't make it. He's buying cattle or buying land. Land. He wants to consolidate. Figures if he owns enough of the water access east of town, the smaller ranchers will have no choice." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "And the bank, does Pike have any connection there?" Elias looked at her. "The bank president and Pike have been hunting partners for 15 years. She wrote something in the margin of her own small notebook. "All right," she said. "That changes the picture somewhat. You see why I'm worried. I see why you're worried, and I see why you haven't moved decisively either direction. You've been waiting to see which way the wind goes before you commit to anything." She set down her pen. "That strategy works if you have time. You may not have time." Papa appeared in the doorway. Papa Rose is crying. Elias stood. "I'll go." "I can go," Vivienne said. And before Elias could respond, she was already up from the table and moving past Samuel toward the back of the house. Elias stood in the kitchen with Clara, who was looking at him with the sharp, evaluating gaze of a 12-year-old who has learned to read situations. "She's not like I thought she'd be," Clara said. "No," Elias agreed. "I thought she'd be soft. Rich women are usually soft. She doesn't seem soft." "No." Clara looked toward the hallway. Rose stopped crying. He listened. She was right. 3 days passed before the first real confrontation with the neighbors came, and it arrived in the form of 2 women from the church committee who stopped by under the guise of welcoming Vivienne and spent approximately 45 minutes in the parlor, asking questions that were dressed up as friendliness, but were actually just a structured assessment of how much money she had and whether she seemed to understand what she'd gotten herself into. Vivienne served them coffee and answered every question with a precision that told them exactly as much as she chose to tell them, and not one syllable more. When they left, Clara said, "Mrs. Adler was trying to find out how much money you have." "I know," Vivienne said. "Did you tell her?" "I told her enough to make it clear I wasn't arriving with a saint. Louis fortune to scatter around, and not so much that she'd run back to her husband, and that information would end up somewhere useful to Judson Pike." Clara looked at her with an expression that was not quite respect, but was heading in that direction. "You knew who Mrs. Adler was before she said her name." "I knew her husband does business with Pike. Your father mentioned it in a letter." Vivienne picked up her coffee cup. "Small towns run on information, Clara. If you want to understand what's actually happening in a place like this, you pay attention to who knows whom and who reports to whom." "It sounds like a lot of work," Clara said. "It's just habit," Vivienne said. "Once you start doing it, you don't stop." On the 5th day, Elias went out to find a note nailed to the fence post at the edge of his property. It was not signed, but the handwriting was not trying very hard to be anonymous. It said, "Your wife's money won't save this place. It'll just make losing it more expensive." He took the note down and put it in his pocket and did not mention it to Vivienne until she found it that evening, because she had been going through his coat pockets looking for the tally sheet he'd mentioned losing. She read it twice. "Pike," she said. "Probably. Definitely." She folded it and put it in her own notebook. "He's worried. He's threatening. If he weren't worried, he wouldn't bother. She looked at Elias steadily. Worried men make mistakes. Patient ones wait for them. Elias sat down on the bench by the door, the way he sat when he was thinking hard, and his body needed to stop moving so his mind could work. I'm not sure you understand how serious he is, he said. He's pushed out 3 ranchers in the past 4 years. Ames, Colbert, and the Purdy widow. All of them thought they'd be fine, and none of them are still here. I know, she said. You know. I asked around when I was at the feed store Tuesday. Colbert's situation especially. The bank called their loan 6 months early. Paperwork was technically within its terms, but the timing was, she stopped. Convenient. Elias looked at her. How long have you been looking into this? Since the 2nd day, she said. I told you I had time to think on the train. I also had time to make a list of questions. And you didn't tell me. I needed to understand what I was actually looking at before I said anything. Telling a worried man more things to worry about before you have anything useful attached to the information isn't helpful. She sat down across from him. I'm telling you now. And here's what I think is useful. Pike is trying to force a timeline. He wants you to feel like you have no options and not enough time. If we can get to spring with the bank obligation restructured and a planting plan for the eastern field, his leverage disappears. That's 3 months. Yes, a lot can go wrong in 3 months. A lot can go wrong in 3 days, she said. It's not an argument for not trying. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Samuel was making some kind of noise in the yard that involved what sounded like a stick and a fence post. Rose's voice floated in from somewhere, high and thin, asking something that got no response. Why are you doing this? Elias said. Vivienne looked at him steadily. I'm here, aren't I? That's not... You asked in a letter why a woman with options would choose a failing ranch in Kansas, she said. I told you in a letter. I'll tell you again out loud. Because this is real. The problem is real, the work is real, and if it works, it will be real too. I spent 12 years doing real work that kept something going, and when it stopped mattering when my brother took it over and turned it into his own vanity project, I had nothing to show for it that was mine. She held his gaze. I'm not trying to save you, Mr. Boone. I'm trying to build something. There's a difference. Elias looked at her for a long time. Elias, he said. She blinked. What? My name. You keep calling me Mr. Boone. She paused. Something shifted in her expression that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. Elias, she said. And I'm going to say yes to the plan, he said. The herd reduction, the restructure, the wheat. I don't know if it'll work. But you're right that doing nothing will just make the losing slower. She nodded. We'll start with the bank. I hate going to that bank. I know. That's why I'm going with you. He looked at her. You want to come. I want to sit in the room, she said. When you tell them you want to restructure, I want to see how they react, and if they say no. Then we know something very useful. She closed her notebook, and we plan accordingly. Outside, Samuel's stick and fence post percussion reached some kind of crescendo and then abruptly stopped, followed by a crash that was probably not serious, but was definitely going to require someone to go out and assess. Elias stood. I'll get him, he said. Elias, he stopped in the doorway. Thank you, Vivienne said, for writing an honest letter. He turned to look at her. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook and the ledgers and the soft lamplight, looking like something that had arrived in his life from a direction he hadn't been watching. Thank you for answering it, he said. He went out to find Samuel, standing over a fallen section of fence, looking both guilty and genuinely interested in the structural question of how it had happened. The night was clear and cold, and the ranch around them was quiet in the way. Frontier nights were quiet, not peaceful exactly, but deeply present, like the land was there and not going anywhere, and that was its own kind of answer to something. Elias fixed the fence section with 2 boards and 4 nails, and the particular satisfaction of a small problem with a clear solution, and when he came back inside, the lamp in the kitchen was still lit. The morning they went to the bank, Vivienne wore her second-best dress. Elias noticed this because he had assumed she would wear the green one, the fine traveling dress that had made Hattie Pierce nearly fall off her folding chair at the station. Instead, she came downstairs in a dark blue wool dress that was still clearly expensive, clearly well-made, but not aggressively so. Not the kind of thing that walked into a room and announced its own cost before the wearer said a word. He didn't say anything about it until they were in the wagon and halfway to town. The blue dress, he said. She glanced at him. What about it? I thought you'd wear the green one. The green one would have made Harlan Pruitt defensive before I opened my mouth. She adjusted her gloves. Men like Pruitt bankmen in small towns, who've been the largest financial authority anyone around them has ever encountered, they don't respond well to being outclassed visually. It makes them feel the need to reassert something. Elias kept his eyes on the road. You've thought about this. I think about most things before I do them. That must be exhausting. She was quiet for a moment. Sometimes, she said, and it was the most unguarded thing she had said to him yet. Harlan Pruitt's office at the Dustfield Savings and Loan was a room that was trying very hard to look more serious than the town around it warranted. Dark wood paneling, a large desk, a portrait of someone important on the wall behind him that was probably not someone he actually knew. Pruitt himself was a man in his mid-50s, with the kind of careful stillness that people develop when they've spent years being the one in the room with the most power and have learned to let other people fill the silence. He shook Elias's hand. He looked at Vivienne with an expression that was professionally neutral and did not quite pull it off. Mrs. Boone, he said, though they were not yet married, and Elias had not corrected this when writing to arrange the meeting. Miss Harcourt, Vivienne said pleasantly. We haven't had the ceremony yet. Thank you. They sat. Pruitt folded his hands on the desk. Mr. Boone, he said, you mentioned in your letter you wanted to discuss the terms of your current loan. We'd like to restructure the payment schedule, Vivienne said. Pruitt's eyes moved to her briefly and then back to Elias, which was a choice, and not a subtle one. Is that so? And what kind of restructuring did you have in mind? Elias had rehearsed this. Vivienne had made him rehearse it twice the previous evening at the kitchen table, while Clara listened and occasionally corrected him when he hedged too much. The current schedule has us carrying $460 against a monthly payment that puts us underwater every time there's any deviation in income, Elias said. I want to extend the term by 18 months and reduce the monthly payment to something the ranch can actually absorb. The loan terms were agreed upon. When I had different expectations about the grazing yields on the East Field, Elias said. Those expectations didn't hold. The ranch's situation changed. I'm not asking for forgiveness of the debt. I'm asking for a term adjustment that lets me actually pay it instead of falling further behind. Pruitt tilted his head slightly. Mr. Boone, you understand that term extensions carry additional interest. We understand, Vivienne said. We've already calculated it. An 18-month extension at your standard rate adds approximately $42 to the total obligation. That is a manageable cost if the monthly payment comes down to a number the ranch's income can reliably meet. She opened the small leather folder she had carried in and placed a single sheet on the desk facing him. This is the ranch's projected income for the next 2 seasons, with conservative estimates on the cattle and a new crop plan for the eastern field. The numbers are documented. The crop contract is pending, but the preliminary agreement with the Callaway grain buyer is in writing. Pruitt looked at the sheet. He did not pick it up immediately. You've got a crop contract, he said. A preliminary agreement, Vivienne said. We plant in spring. The yield won't be known until harvest, obviously. But Callaway doesn't make preliminary agreements with operations he considers poor risks. Pruitt picked up the sheet. His expression did not change exactly, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted, the way a man's posture shifts when he has walked into a conversation expecting one thing and found another. He read the sheet twice. I'll need to review this with the board, he said. Of course, Vivienne said. We're not asking for an answer today. We're asking for the conversation to be had. They stood to leave. Pruitt shook Elias's hand again. He looked at Vivienne for a moment and then said, You've done this kind of thing before, Miss Harcourt. I managed business accounts for 12 years, she said. Yes. In St. Louis. Yes. He nodded slowly. That sheet is good work, he said. It sounded like it cost him something to say it. Thank you, Mr. Pruitt, she said and walked out. In the wagon, 3 blocks from the bank, Elias exhaled like he had been holding his breath for the entire meeting. He's going to talk to Pike, he said. Probably today, Vivienne agreed. That doesn't worry you. It tells us something. If Pike tells him to reject the restructuring, we know exactly how far that relationship goes. If Pruitt approves it anyway, we know we've got more room than we thought. She watched the storefronts go by. Either way, we've moved something. Elias turned to look at her. You're using the bank meeting to test Pike's reach. I'm also genuinely trying to restructure the loan, she said. It can be both things. He faced forward. The horse, an old bay named Creed, who had strong opinions about puddles, was navigating a rough patch of road with his usual theatrical resentment. Clara asked me last night if you were going to stay, Elias said. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. What did you tell her? I told her I thought so. That was honest of you. I wasn't sure if it was the right answer. It was the accurate one, she said. That's usually better than right. They rode in silence for a little while, the kind that had started to feel less like discomfort and more like two people who did not need to fill space unnecessarily. Samuel asked me if you knew how to ride, Elias said. I do. Not well, but adequately. He's going to ask you to prove it. I assumed, she said, when he's ready. The trouble with the neighbors came not from Judson Pike directly, but from a man named Walt Greer, who ran a mid-size operation 2 miles south, and who had a gift for making his opinions sound like community concern. Walt showed up at the ranch on a Thursday morning while Elias was working the cattle pen and Vivienne was in the house going through seed catalogs with Clara. Walt did not knock. He leaned on the fence and called out until Elias came over, and then he stood with his thumbs in his belt and his hat pushed back in the way men did when they were about to say something they had practiced saying casually. Just checking in, Walt said, being neighborly. Appreciate it, Elias said. Heard you went to the bank. News in Dustfield traveled faster than weather. Had some business there, Elias said. Heard you brought the woman. Elias looked at him. She has a name. Walt held up a hand. No offense meant, Elias. Look, people are talking. That's all I'm saying. A woman from St. Louis coming in with a lot of money and a lot of opinions about how a cattle ranch should run. She hasn't told anyone how to run their ranch, Elias said. She told you to plant wheat, Walt said, and then stopped, because he had just demonstrated that he knew more about Elias's private conversations than a man could know through ordinary neighborly awareness. Elias went still. Where'd you hear that? Walt had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Talk. Elias. Which people, Walt? Walt looked away toward the fence line. Look, I'm just saying. People are wondering what she's really after. A woman like that doesn't just come out here out of charity. She's got to want something. She wants to build something, Elias said. Same as I do. Same as anybody out here. Or she wants to control something, Walt said. Property goes both ways in a marriage, Elias. You know that. A rich woman marries a poor man. Get off my fence, Elias said. Walt blinked. I'm trying to look out for you. You're trying to deliver a message for someone who didn't want to deliver it himself, Elias said. And you've done it. Now get off my fence. Walt got off the fence. He rode back down the road with the particular stiffness of a man who had expected a different conversation and was now going to have to report that it hadn't gone the way it was supposed to. When Elias came back to the house, Vivienne was standing at the kitchen window. I heard some of that, she said. I figured. He's right that property law cuts both ways. Elias stopped. Is that supposed to reassure me or scare me? Neither. It's supposed to be accurate. She turned from the window. I'm not interested in your land, Elias. I'm interested in what we can make of it together. Those are different things. But you should know the law, and so should I, and we should be clear with each other about it rather than pretend the question doesn't exist. He sat down at the table. Pike sent him. Yes. Which means Pike is worried enough to start testing whether he can get to me through the neighbors. Yes. Which means your theory about worried men making mistakes might be right. Might, she said. We'll see. Clara came in from the back room with a flour-dusty apron and a look that said she had heard more than either of them intended. She went to the basin and washed her hands and didn't say anything, which was how Clara handled things she was processing. After a moment, she said, without turning around, Mr. Greer's wife gets her dry goods from the same supplier as Pike. I heard Mrs. Tuttle say so at the church social 3 weeks ago. Elias and Vivienne both looked at her back. The supplier sets prices, Clara continued, still washing her hands. If Pike controls the supplier, he controls what people pay for things. And if people are paying too much, they run short. And if they run short, they need loans. And if they need loans, they go to the bank, Vivienne said quietly. Clara dried her hands and turned around. She looked at Vivienne with that 12-year-old's direct, unornamented gaze. I've been thinking about it since you mentioned the supply prices the other night. Vivienne looked at her for a long moment. What else have you been thinking? That if you could prove the prices were being manipulated, you could probably convince the people Pike's been squeezing to get angry at him instead of at each other. Clara folded the dish towel precisely. But you'd need records. Purchase records from enough different ranches to show the pattern. Elias was staring at his daughter, Clara, he said. What? When did you get like this? She looked at him with an expression that was half exasperated and half something he couldn't name. I've been paying attention, Papa, she said. I just didn't have anyone to pay attention with before. That night, after the children were in bed, Elias and Vivienne sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee that had gone cold and a problem that had grown larger and more interesting than either of them had initially mapped. If Clara's right about the supply prices, Elias started. She is, Vivienne said. I've already been looking at it from a different angle. The feed prices in this county are running about 18% above what I'd expect based on the regional market. That's not drought. That's not transportation. That's deliberate. You've been tracking feed prices. I've been tracking everything I can track since I got here. She turned her notebook toward him. There were columns of numbers, dates, supplier names, cross-referenced against what she'd been able to find in old receipts from his records and from conversations she'd had in town while buying supplies. If I can get purchase records from 3 or 4 other ranches, not the ones Pike controls, the ones still independent, I can build a comparison that shows the pattern clearly. And then what? Elias said. We take it to Pruitt? To Pike's hunting partner? No. We take it to the ranchers themselves. She closed the notebook. Pike's strength is that the people he's squeezing don't know they're being squeezed by the same hand. They each think they've got individual bad luck, individual money problems. If they understood it was coordinated, they might push back together, Elias said. Or they might fold anyway, because they're scared, she said. I won't pretend I know which way it goes. People who are tired and frightened don't always choose to fight even when they understand the fight. But some of them will. Some of them will, she agreed. He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them was throwing uneven light, and she had a pencil tucked behind her ear that she'd forgotten was there, and her hair had come half loose from its pins over the course of the evening. She looked less like the woman who had gotten off the train in the fine green dress, and more like someone who lived in this kitchen, in this problem, in this life. He wasn't sure when that had started happening. I need to ask you something, he said. She waited. When you came here, and I mean really, honestly, did you understand it was going to be this? He gestured vaguely, meaning the table, the ledgers, the cold coffee, the whole weight of the situation. Or did you think it was going to be something more straightforward? Vivienne looked at him for a moment. I thought it was going to be hard, she said. I didn't think it was going to be this specific kind of hard. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. The ranch being in debt, I had accounted for that. The children needing time, I had accounted for that. Judson Pike being what he is, I hadn't fully accounted for that. Does it change anything, he said. For you? No, she said. And she said it without hesitation and without decoration, which was how he had come to understand she said things she meant. The bank sent a letter 6 days later. It came in the Morning Post, and Elias stood in the yard with it unopened for slightly longer than was rational before Clara came out and said, Papa. Just read it, with the pragmatic weariness of a child who has watched her father wrestle with things that could be resolved by simply doing them. He opened it. Pruitt had approved a modified restructuring. Not exactly what Vivienne had proposed. The term extension was 12 months rather than 18, and the interest adjustment was slightly less favorable, but the monthly payment came down to a number the ranch could manage if the season held. Elias read it twice, and then went inside and put it on the table in front of Vivienne without saying anything. She read it. It's not what we asked for. No, but it's workable. Yes, she set it down. Pike didn't block it. Or Pruitt ignored him. Or Pike decided not to move yet because he wants to see what we do with the breathing room. She folded the letter carefully and handed it back. Either way, we have time now. Not much, but enough. Samuel appeared in the doorway with his boots on the wrong feet, which he did not appear to notice, and announced that one of the young heifers was behaving strangely near the south fence, and could someone come look? Elias went. Vivienne, after a moment, followed. The heifer was fine, young, and irritable, and not accustomed to the particular corner of fence she had found herself in, but fine. Samuel stood beside Vivienne while they watched Elias coax the animal back toward the rest of the herd. And after a minute, Samuel said, without looking at her, "Can you really ride?" "Adequately," Vivienne said. "What's adequately mean?" "It means I won't fall off, but I won't impress anyone." Samuel considered this. "Papa said you grew up in the city." "St. Louis, yes." "Did you have horses?" "A neighbor had horses." "I learned on his." "Did you fall off?" "Several times." He squinted at the field. "Papa fell off last summer." "He doesn't like to talk about it." "Most people don't like talking about falling off things," Vivienne said. "I fell off the barn roof 2 years ago," Samuel said. Vivienne looked at him. "How?" "I was seeing how far I could walk along the edge." He delivered this information with perfect equanimity. "It wasn't that far. Are you all right? I broke my arm." "It's fine now." He held it up as evidence. "Clara yelled at me for a long time." "That sounds like Clara. She said I was the stupidest person she'd ever met in her life." He said this without any resentment. "She was pretty upset. She cried after, but she didn't want me to see." Vivienne looked at the field where Elias was walking the heifer back with a steadiness and patience that she had come to understand was his fundamental mode of operating, not dramatic, not fast, just utterly unwilling to quit. "Your sister loves you a great deal," Vivienne said. "I know," Samuel said. "She just doesn't like to say things out loud. Some people are like that." He looked up at her. "Are you like that?" Vivienne thought about it honestly. "Somewhat," she said. "I'm better at facts than feelings." "Papa's the opposite," Samuel said. "He's got a lot of feelings, but he doesn't know what to do with them." Vivienne looked down at him. He was 9 years old, and he had just described his father more accurately than most adults could have managed. "You're very observant," she said. "Clara says I'd be smarter if I paid more attention," Samuel said. "But I think I pay plenty of attention, just to different things than she does." The weeks that followed were not smooth. Elias had never expected smooth, and Vivienne had not come west looking for it. But there were days when the specific texture of the difficulty ground at both of them in ways that were hard to name. The seed order went wrong the first time, a miscommunication with the supply merchant that resulted in the wrong variety arriving 2 weeks before it was supposed to. Vivienne spent an entire afternoon in a taut, controlled argument with the merchant's representative in town, while Elias stood nearby feeling simultaneously useful for being present and useless for not being the one with the knowledge to conduct the argument. They got most of it corrected. Not all. The planting schedule shifted by 9 days. 9 days mattered. Elias said, "We can still make the window." Vivienne said, "We have to make the window," which was different, and both of them knew it. The children noticed the tension the way children do, not through any specific event, but through the accumulation of slightly shorter answers, slightly longer silences, slightly more careful movements around the adults in the house. Samuel dealt with this by spending more time outdoors. Clara dealt with it by being more visibly useful than usual, bringing coffee without being asked, finishing chores before they were assigned. Rose dealt with it by following Vivienne more closely than she had before, not saying much, just staying within a few feet like a small, watchful shadow. Vivienne noticed. One evening she sat down on the back step where Rose had stationed herself, and they sat together in the cooling air for a while, not talking. Then Rose said, "Are you going to go away?" "No," Vivienne said. "Mama went away," Rose said. It was stated simply, as simple fact. "I know," Vivienne said. "I'm sorry about that." "She didn't want to," Rose said, which was also just fact, and something that someone, probably Elias, had made sure Rose understood. "It just happened." "Yes." Rose pulled at a loose thread on her apron. "But you could want to." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "But I don't." Rose considered this. "Why not?" "Because I came here to stay," Vivienne said. "And because you and your brother and sister are worth staying for. And because your father is worth staying for." She paused. "And because I am not the kind of person who starts things and doesn't finish them." Rose pulled the thread free and looked at it. "Clara says you're different from what she thought you'd be." "What did she think I'd be?" "She thought you'd be like the ladies from church. Nice on top and sharp underneath." Rose dropped the thread. "She says you're the other way around." Vivienne blinked. "Sharp on top and nice underneath." Rose leaned slightly against Vivienne's arm, very slightly, testing. When Vivienne didn't move away, Rose stayed. They sat there until the dark came in properly, and Elias appeared in the doorway and stood for a moment looking at them without saying anything. Then he said, "Rose, time for bed," and Rose went in without argument, which was not her usual pattern. Elias stayed in the doorway after she went up. She doesn't usually go without the whole negotiation, he said. She was tired, Vivienne said. He was quiet. Thank you. For whatever you said to her. She asked if I was going to leave. He absorbed this. What did you tell her? The truth, Vivienne said. I'm not. He leaned against the doorframe. The night behind Vivienne was dark and clear, the kind of prairie dark that had a weight to it, and he was looking at her with an expression she had started to recognize as the one he used when he was close to saying something he had been thinking for a long time. You know what the hardest part of all this is, he said. Which part? Trusting that it's real. He said it simply, without self-pity. 3 years of managing alone, you stop expecting things to go right. You start waiting for the part where it falls apart again. He looked at his hands on the doorframe. Having someone here who's actually here, it doesn't just fix things. It makes me aware of how much I got used to everything being broken. Vivienne stood from the step and turned to face him. That's not a comfortable thing to know about yourself, she said. No, he said. It's not. It's honest, though. I'm working on being that. She looked at him for a moment in the way she looked at things she was genuinely thinking about. So am I, she said, working on things. She went inside. He stayed in the doorway another minute, listening to the dark, and then he went in too and shut the door behind him against the night. And the lamp in the kitchen burned low and steady, the way it had started to do every evening now, reliable as something earned rather than something assumed. The wheat went in 9 days late, and Elias did not sleep well for the week after. He would get up before dawn and go out to the eastern field and stand at the edge of it in the cold dark, looking at ground that showed nothing yet, just turned soil and the particular smell of earth that had been worked and seeded and was now doing whatever it was going to do without any input from him. Farming required a specific kind of patience that was different from the patience required by cattle. Cattle gave you feedback. They moved, they ate, they made noise. They showed you their condition. Soil just sat there and made you wait. Vivienne found him out there on the third morning. She did not say anything about the hour or the cold. She stood beside him at the field's edge, with her coat pulled close, and looked at the same dark ground he was looking at. The variety we got isn't ideal for the late planting, Elias said. He had been thinking it for 3 days, and it came out like a confession. No, she agreed, but it's hardier than the original order. Lower ceiling on the yield, but more tolerant of a compressed season. You knew that when we took it. I considered it, she said. The alternative was waiting for the right variety and losing more of the planting window. A lower yield from the right timing beats a higher potential yield that we miss entirely. He turned that over. You made a call without telling me. I made a recommendation to the merchant and told you about the variety change the same evening. She looked at him. I didn't hide it. You didn't explain the trade-off. She was quiet for a moment. You're right, she said. I should have explained it rather than just reporting what happened. That was a mistake. He had expected her to defend the decision, and the absence of that defense caught him off guard. He looked at her profile in the dark, the straight line of her nose, the set of her jaw. The decision was probably right, he said. Probably, she said. We'll know in 3 months. They stood there a while longer. Somewhere behind them in the house, Rose was starting to make the small sounds that meant she was waking up. The sky to the east had the gray edge that comes before any actual light, just the first suggestion that dark was not permanent. Margaret used to come out here, Elias said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things did when he was tired and his guard was down. She'd stand at the edge of the field and just look at it. Didn't matter what was growing or what wasn't. She said she liked seeing where the land stopped being wild. Vivienne did not say anything immediately, which was the right response. She waited. I don't talk about her much, he said. With the children, I try. But it takes something out of me every time. You don't have to explain that, Vivienne said. I'm not explaining it. He stopped. I'm not sure what I'm doing. Talking, she said. That's all. You don't have to be doing anything else. He nodded once. They went back inside when Rose's sounds became more insistent, and Elias made coffee while Vivienne went upstairs. And that was the end of the conversation. But something in it had shifted. The way a door that has been stuck finally gives under steady pressure without any dramatic moment of giving. The planting settled into a rhythm over the following 2 weeks that was not comfortable exactly, but was functional, which Elias had learned to recognize as about as good as things got on a working ranch in an uncertain season. He and Samuel worked the cattle in the mornings, while Vivienne and Clara managed the house accounts and the correspondence with the Callaway grain buyer. In the afternoons, Elias worked the eastern field, checking moisture, checking emergence, checking the dozen small variables that added up to whether a crop grew or didn't. Vivienne began accompanying him more afternoons than not because she knew more about wheat than he did, but because 4 eyes caught things, 2 eyes missed, and because she had a habit of asking questions about what he was seeing that forced him to articulate things he had previously just intuited, which turned out to be useful. "What does the discoloration on that patch mean?" she said one afternoon, pointing at a small section of the field where the emerging shoots had a slightly different character. "Drainage issue," he said. "There's a low spot there. Water sits longer. Can we correct it? I can cut a shallow channel to redirect the runoff. Done it before on the west field." He looked at the patch. "Means losing about 30 square feet of crop in that section, versus losing the whole patch if we don't." "Yes." "Do the channel," she said. "I was going to," he said. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to understand the decision." That was how most of their field conversations went. She was not trying to direct the work, she was trying to understand it, which was different, and which Elias had come to appreciate, because it meant that when she did offer a suggestion, it was grounded in what was actually there rather than what she thought should be there. The first sign that Judson Pike had escalated his approach came not from anything dramatic, but from a pattern that Vivienne noticed before Elias did. 3 of their regular suppliers, the man who sold them tack, and the woman who ran the dry goods, and the merchant who provided the repair lumber, all raised their prices within the same 2-week window. Not massively. Just enough. Just enough that each increase taken alone could be attributed to market conditions or transport costs, or any of the dozen ordinary explanations that covered price movements in a frontier town. Taken together, they formed a pattern that had a shape. Vivienne put the receipts on the table one evening and arranged them chronologically and did not say anything until Elias had looked at them long enough to see it. "Same 2 weeks," he said, "and none of them went up in the 4 months before that," she said. "I checked against the older receipts in your box. That's not market movement." "No," she said. "It's coordinated." Elias sat back. "He's trying to squeeze us without touching the bank loan again. He wants to increase our costs faster than our income can grow. If our operating expenses go up 15% and our income stays flat through the planting season, we're back to bleeding by harvest, even if the crop comes in well. Can we go around him? Buy from suppliers in the next county? We can for some things. Not everything. The transport costs offset some of the savings." She tapped the receipts. "But Clara's been building the supply price record I mentioned. I've also been collecting what I can from 2 other ranchers, the Fenwick operation and old Hargrove's place, and their numbers show the same pattern going back further, 18 months at least." Elias was quiet for a moment. "You've been talking to Fenwick." "His wife, mostly. Ada Fenwick is a sharp woman. She's been watching her husband's accounts for years, and she had the same feeling about it that Clara did, that the numbers had a shape that wasn't natural. She just didn't have anyone to compare them with." "Does Fenwick know you've been talking to his wife about this?" Ada told him. "He's cautious, doesn't want to move against Pike publicly, but he let her share the records." Vivienne looked at him steadily. "We're not alone in this, Elias. That's what I'm trying to show you. Pike has been managing this county like a private operation for years, and there are people who know something's wrong and have been isolated with that knowledge." "Isolated is right," Elias said. "Fenwick won't move publicly. Hargrove's too old and too tired. Who else have you got?" 3 others I haven't approached yet," she said. "I wanted to know what we had before I made more promises." He looked at her across the table. "You're building a case." "I'm building documentation," she said. "A case is what you do with documentation when you have enough of it." "And when do we have enough?" "Not yet," she said. "We need the harvest first. The crop contract numbers take whatever Pike tries to say about us, and they answer it in numbers, which is harder to argue with than reputation." It was a long game. Elias understood long games intellectually, but his bones were tired of playing one, and the tiredness sometimes pushed words out of him that he wished he could pull back. "What if the crop fails?" he said. Vivienne looked at him. Not with pity, not with false reassurance. "Then we're in a harder position, and we figure out what we can do from that position," she said. I don't have a version of this where I can guarantee you the crop comes in. I know. Do you want me to pretend otherwise? No, he said. I've had enough people pretend things were fine. All right, she said. Then I won't. They sat with that for a moment, the honest weight of it, and then Clara came in from the back room and said the water in the pot had boiled away again, and did either of them want actual coffee, or were they just going to keep letting it burn? And the moment passed into the ordinary domestic chaos that was also part of what this life was. The storm came in a Thursday in late April, with almost no warning. The sky had been building all morning in a way that Elias didn't like, not the slow gray accumulation of a regular rain system, but a hard, fast darkening from the northwest that had a greenish quality to it that meant nothing good. He got the cattle into the lower pasture by midday and told Samuel to get the tools from the yard into the shed. Clara brought the washing in from the line at a run. Vivienne, who had no personal experience of prairie weather at this scale, watched the sky from the back porch for about 90 seconds, and then went inside and began moving anything breakable away from the north-facing windows without being asked, which told Elias that whatever she lacked in direct experience, she compensated for in the ability to read a situation fast. The wind came first, then the rain, almost horizontal, the kind of rain that found every gap in every structure and pushed through without ceremony. Then the hail, not the worst hail Elias had seen, but bad enough, marble-sized and fast, hammering the roof with a sound like the whole building was being worked over from above. They sat in the main room, all 5 of them, with the shutters latched and the lamp turned low to keep it from drawing attention to itself. Rose was under a blanket with her head on Clara's lap, not quite frightened, but not quite not frightened. Samuel was at the window, trying to see through the gap in the shutters, which was his nature and could not be corrected by anything short of physical restraint. Samuel, Elias said, I'm just looking. There's nothing to see in hail. There might be. Vivienne, who was sitting at the table with her hands flat on the surface in the particular posture she used when she was concentrating, said without looking up, Samuel, come sit down. When the sound changes, I'll tell you. Samuel looked at her. How will you know when it changes? Because I'm listening to it, she said. Come sit. He came and sat. He lasted 4 minutes before he went back to the window, which was actually better than Elias had expected. The storm ran for about 2 hours. When the hail stopped and the rain gentled and the wind dropped from a roar to a push, Elias went out to assess. The eastern field had taken damage. Not catastrophic, the young wheat shoots were flattened in patches, but most of them would recover, he thought. He hoped the root systems were still establishing, and young wheat had some resilience if the ground didn't stay saturated. He walked the rows in the mud and the rain's aftermath, and made himself look at what was there, rather than what he feared, which was a discipline that took effort. Then he looked at the barn, the left side support beam, the one Vivienne had identified the day she arrived, the one he had been shoring up and meaning to replace and had not gotten to it given. Not completely. The barn was still standing. But the left wall had shifted inward, and the roof on that side had dropped at the corner, and the damage was structural in the way that meant it was not going to get better on its own, and was going to get worse with any additional load. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at it for a long time. The cost of proper repair was not a number he could reach right now, not with the planting costs still on the ledger, and the restructured loan payments, and the operating costs that Pike's supply manipulation had pushed up. The numbers did not add up to a repaired barn. They added up to a choice between the barn and something else that also needed doing, and whichever thing he chose, the other thing didn't get done. He was still standing there when Vivienne appeared beside him. She looked at the wall. She looked at the roof corner. She did the same thing he had done, made herself see what was there. How bad, she said. Bad enough that I can't leave it. He did not look at her. The repair, a proper repair, not a shore-up, is going to cost more than I can put against it right now without pulling from somewhere else. Planting costs or the loan payment, she said. One or the other. She was quiet for a moment. Show me the wall from inside. They went in. He showed her the beam, the place where the rot had been hiding under the surface damage he'd been patching, the way the shift had transferred stress to 2 other points. She looked at all of it with the careful attention she gave to ledgers and seed catalogs, which was the same attention, and he had stopped being surprised by it. What does a full repair require? She said. New main beam, new secondary support on the left run, reattach the roof section properly. Materials and someone who knows what they're doing. He named a number. She did not react to the number visibly. And if we do a partial repair, stabilize it enough to get through the season without it worsening. Maybe half that. But it's a risk. A hard wind, another storm, it could go further. It could go further with a full repair too, if the next storm is bad enough. Yes, he said, but the odds are better. She looked at the beam for another moment. Then she said, I have money available. He turned to look at her. Vivienne, not the ranch money, she said, my personal funds. The money I came with. I've been keeping it separate deliberately, because I didn't want you to feel like it was being used to paper over problems that needed real solutions. She faced him directly. This is not papering over. This is a structural repair to a working building that the ranch needs to function. That's a legitimate use of an investment. It's not your obligation to fund repairs. I know it's not my obligation, she said, with a patience that had a slight edge to it. I'm choosing to. There is a difference between those two things, and I'd appreciate it if you'd let me make my own choices about my own money. He stopped. She was right, and he knew she was right, and he also knew that the thing pushing back in him was not logic but pride. The same pride that had kept him managing crisis by crisis for 3 years, rather than asking for help. The pride that Walt Greer had tried to use against him on behalf of Judson Pike. Half from me, he said. I'll pull it from the cattle fund. It'll hurt, but it won't break us. She looked at him for a moment. Half from each. Yes. All right, she said, that works. They went back outside. The afternoon was clearing, the way prairie skies cleared after storms fast and complete, like the weather had decided it was done and moved on without apology. The light came back hard and gold, and the mud in the yard steamed faintly. Samuel was examining the hail damage to the yard fence with the deep scientific interest he brought to all structural failures. Clara was on the back step with Rose, checking her over for any signs of distress and finding, by all appearances, that Rose had managed the storm better than any of them had expected. The wheat's going to be all right, Elias said. He was not entirely certain of this, but he was more certain than he'd been looking at it 20 minutes ago. Some of it, Vivienne said. Some of it is enough. She looked at the field. Yes, she said, some of it is enough. The barn repair took 11 days. Elias brought in a man named Corbett from the east side of the county, who had the skills, and who did not have a known relationship with Judson Pike, which had become a relevant consideration in who they hired for things. Corbett was quiet and methodical, and did not offer opinions about things outside his area of knowledge, which Elias respected. The work went steadily and without drama, which was not the same as going well. There were days when the weather didn't cooperate, and days when a piece of material turned out to be the wrong dimension and had to be redone. And one afternoon, when Corbett's helper dropped a roof section, and Elias spent 3 hours helping reset it. But it went, and by the end of 11 days, the barn was structurally sound, in the way it had not been since before Margaret died. The morning Corbett finished, Elias went into the barn and stood in it and breathed. Clara found him there. She came in and stood beside him and looked at the repaired beam, the new roof section, the wall that stood straight. It looks better, she said. It is better, he said. Vivienne paid half, Clara said. It was not a question. Yes. Clara was quiet for a moment. She doesn't have to do these things. She knows that. Is that why she does them? Because she knows she doesn't have to? Elias looked at his daughter. What do you mean? I mean, Clara paused, working out something she had been thinking about for a while. Mama did things because we needed them done. That was love, but it was just what had to happen. Vivienne does things that don't have to happen. Nobody made her come here. Nobody made her pay for half the barn. She looked at the beam. She's choosing all of it. Elias did not say anything for a moment. The barn smelled of fresh lumber and old hay, and the particular dry dustiness of a space that animals had lived in for years. Yes, he said finally. She is. Clara nodded once, like something had been confirmed rather than discovered. Then she went back to the house. What Elias did not know, and would not know for another 2 weeks, was that Judson Pike had been watching the barn repair. Not personally, Pike did not do his own watching. But he had people who did, and the information that the Boone Ranch had found money for a full structural repair, when it should have been on the edge of its operating funds, found its way back upon Pike to Pike through the channels. That information traveled in a county where he had spent years cultivating exactly that kind of reach. Pike's response came through a man named Teller, who worked a small property on the county's eastern edge as a nominal rancher, but whose actual function, as Vivienne had identified 2 weeks prior from a pattern in his movements and associations, was as Pike's information broker. Teller began showing up in conversations at the feed store, the livery, the post office, not saying anything direct, just inserting suggestions that had a specific shape. That the Boone outfit was spending beyond its means. That the woman from St. Louis was managing the money in a way that didn't bode well for Elias's actual ownership of the property. That a man who let his wife handle the finances was a man who didn't really control what he had. It was targeted, and it was patient, and it was exactly the kind of thing that could work on men who were already uncertain, and already inclined to wonder if their neighbor's stability was real or borrowed. Vivienne heard about it from Ada Fenwick, who had heard it at the dry goods store and brought it to Vivienne's attention with the directness of a woman who had decided to be useful. "He's trying to separate you from the community," Ada said. They were sitting in the Fenwick kitchen, which smelled of bread and was considerably warmer than anywhere in the Boone house, because the Fenwick stove worked properly. Make it so the other ranchers see Elias as compromised. A man under a woman's control is easier to dismiss. The other ranchers who might otherwise compare notes about their supply costs, Vivienne said. Ada looked at her with a small knowing expression. "You've already been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about what Pike does when he's worried," Vivienne said. "He doesn't attack directly, he undermines. He makes people doubt the thing he can't break frontally." "And what do you do about that?" Ada said. "I make the thing he's trying to undermine visible and solid enough that doubt can't get purchase on it." Vivienne held her coffee cup. "The supply price documentation, how complete is what you have?" 18 months, like I told you. Maybe 20 if I go back through the older records. How would your husband feel about showing those records to 2 other ranchers? Not filing anything, not making anything public yet. Just showing, letting them see the shape of it. Ada was quiet for a moment. "Which 2 ranchers?" "Hargrove and a man named Sutter on the west side. Sutter's been losing ground for 3 years and he can't figure out why. His land is good, his operation is solid, but the numbers keep closing in on him. And you think if he saw the supply records, I think if he saw the supply records alongside his own accounts, he would see the same shape Clara saw," Vivienne said. "And then he would stop thinking it was his own fault." Ada set down her cup. "My husband is cautious," she said. "He won't do anything that he thinks could blow back on our place." "I know," Vivienne said. "I'm not asking him to do anything yet. I'm asking him to look at something and let someone else look at it. That's all." Ada was quiet for a longer moment, the way women are quiet when they are making a decision that their husbands will be told about, but that is fundamentally theirs to make. "Let me talk to him tonight," she said. Vivienne rode home in the late afternoon, with a particular sensation of something being put in motion that could not easily be stopped once it started moving, which was both satisfying and frightening in roughly equal measure. She found Elias at the eastern field, where he had been spending time every day since the storm, walking the rows and watching the recovery with the careful patience of a man who had learned to be patient, not because it was easy, but because the alternative had stopped working. He looked up when she came. "The wheat's straightening," he said. She looked at the field. The storm-flattened sections had been rising slowly over the past week, the shoots finding their orientation again. Not all of them. Not the ones that had been under the hail, but enough. "Fenwick will show Sutter the supply records," she said. He absorbed this. "That's movement." "Small movement," she said. "But yes." He looked at the field a moment longer. The afternoon light was low and golden across the top of the emerging crop, the way late-day light on some growing things looked like something worth working for. "This is going to work," he said. He said it the way a man says something he is deciding to believe, rather than something he is certain of, which was honest. "Some of it will," Vivienne said. He looked at her. Something in his expression was different from what it had been 3 months ago, less closed, less braced. He still looked tired. He would probably always look somewhat tired. It was written into him by 3 years of managing alone, but underneath the tiredness there was something that had not been there before. "You told Rose you weren't the kind of person who starts things and doesn't finish them," he said. She paused. "She told you that. She tells me most things. Tells them slowly." He looked back at the field. "I've been thinking about it, whether I believe it. And I believe it," he said. It came out quietly and without ceremony, which was how he said things he meant. She stood beside him at the edge of the field for a while, looking at the growing wheat in the failing light, and the ranch around them was not fixed and not safe and not guaranteed, but it was working, and they were both working on it. And out there on the Kansas frontier, with the wind coming down from the northwest and the barn repaired and the crop in the ground, that was as close to solid ground as either of them had managed to stand on in longer than they could easily say. The letter from the bank arrived on a Wednesday, which was Elias's least favorite day of the week, for no reason he could articulate beyond the fact that bad things seemed to have a preference for it. He was at the eastern field when Clara brought it out, walking toward him across the uneven ground, with the envelope held away from her body slightly. The way she carried things she did not trust. He saw her coming, and he knew from her posture before she was close enough to read her face. Took the envelope. He opened it, standing there at the edge of the wheat, which had been coming in slowly, and with the particular stubbornness of something that had been knocked down and was getting back up on its own terms. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and stood looking at the crop for a minute. "Papa," Clara said, "go get Vivienne, please." Clara went. She did not ask what the letter said, which told him she had already formed a reasonable guess. Vivienne came out with her coat half-buttoned and a pencil still in her hand, which meant Clara had found her at the accounts. She crossed the field toward him, and he held out the letter without preamble, and she read it standing in the wheat rows, with the wind coming in from the northwest, and her hair moving across her face in a way she ignored. She read it once, she read it again. 30 days, she said. To pay the balance in full, Elias said. Not the monthly payment. The full remaining balance. They're calling the restructured loan. They're saying I defaulted on a provision I was not aware of. He took the letter back and pointed to the relevant paragraph, which he had read enough times now to nearly have it memorized. There's language in the restructured agreement about maintaining operating solvency. Pruitt's office is claiming the barn repair constituted an unauthorized capital expenditure that put us in technical violation. Vivienne looked at the paragraph. Her expression did not change dramatically, but her jaw tightened in a way he had come to recognize. That provision wasn't in the original loan documents, she said. I know. Or in the restructured terms they sent us. I know, then it was added after, she said quietly. Or it's being interpreted in a way it was never intended to be interpreted. Either way, the effect is the same, Elias said. 30 days. I don't have the full balance. You know I don't have the full balance. She was quiet for a moment. The wheat moved around them in the wind, rows of it, pale and green. Not yet at the height it would reach by harvest, but getting there. The slow getting there of things that were alive and working, and had no knowledge of the letter sitting in Elias's shirt pocket. How much of the balance, she said. He named the number. She turned it over, visibly, running it against whatever she had in her head. My personal funds, I could cover part of it, she said. Not all. And if I put it toward the loan balance, we don't have operating capital for the harvest. And without the harvest, we can't. I know, she said. I know the math. He looked at her. This is Pike. Yes. He got to Pruitt. He got to someone at the bank, or he is someone at the bank in every way that matters. She folded her arms across her chest, not defensively, but the way she did when she was working through something and needed her body to be still so her mind could move. He waited until we had spent money on the barn. He waited until our operating funds were at their lowest point in the season. He picked the moment. He's patient, Elias said. He's been doing this for years, she said. He's had practice. They stood there with that knowledge for a moment, the size of it, the specific shape of a man who had been running this county like a private system for long enough that it had become ordinary, and who was now applying the full weight of that system to one small ranch because a woman from St. Louis had shown up and started asking the wrong questions. What do we do, Elias said. She looked at the field. We don't let him set the timeline, she said. That's the first thing. He wants us reacting, scrambling, making decisions under pressure, because decisions made under pressure are usually bad decisions. We don't do that. We have 30 days. We have 30 days, which is more than he'd like us to have if we use them well. She turned to face him fully. The crop contract with Callaway, what's the status? Final agreement is ready to sign. I was waiting until the crop was closer to harvest to have the numbers firmer. Sign it this week, she said. Get the contract in writing with the delivery date and the price per bushel. A signed crop contract with a known buyer at a known price is collateral. It's documented future income. Pruitt can ignore it. Pruitt might, she said. But Pruitt is not the only person in this county with the ability to create problems for Judson Pike. She looked at him steadily. I need to go to town. Not today, I need 2 days to put together what I'm going to bring with me. But I need to go to town, and I need to walk into a specific conversation with everything we have documented, and I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. He looked at her for a long moment. What are you planning? I'm planning to stop letting Pike be the only one who gets to define what this situation is, she said. He's been managing the information in this county. What people know, what they think they know, who looks stable and who looks desperate. I'm going to change the information by going to town and talking. By going to town and showing, she said. There's a difference. He was not entirely sure there was but he also was not entirely sure she was wrong. And since she had been right more often than not, since the day she arrived, he gave her the 2 days she asked for. Those whose 2 days were their own kind of difficult. Elias went about the ranch work with the focused determination of a man who knows that the only thing he can control is what's directly in front of him, and so he controlled it: the cattle, the fence line that needed a new post on the south end, the water level in the trough, the daily walk of the wheat field. Samuel followed him through most of it, sensing without being told that his father needed company more than he needed quiet, and providing it in the particular way of a 9-year-old, which involved a continuous low-level commentary on everything they encountered, and periodic questions that had nothing to do with anything. Do you think crows understand what fences are for? Samuel asked on the second morning, watching one sit on the fence post they had just replaced. Probably not, Elias said. Then what do they think the fence is? A convenient place to sit. That's practical, Samuel said thoughtfully. It is. Samuel looked at the crow for another moment. Is Vivienne going to fix the bank thing? Elias paused in his work. What do you know about the bank thing? Clara told me there was a letter. She didn't say what it said, but she had the face she makes when something's wrong, and she's decided not to panic about it. He looked at his father. Is it bad? It's a problem, Elias said. We're working on it. Vivienne's been up late, Samuel said. I heard her at the table past midnight. Elias did not say anything. She doesn't have to do that, Samuel said. She has money, right? She could go back to St. Louis if it got too hard. She could, Elias said. But she's up at midnight working on our problem instead. Yes. Samuel considered this with the gravity he brought to genuinely important questions, which was distinct from his commentary on crows and fences. I think she's ours now, he said finally, like Creed is ours. Even though we got her from somewhere else. Elias looked at his son for a moment. Creed came from a horse trader in Abilene, he said. Right, but he's ours now, Samuel said. You can tell because he complained specifically about our puddles and not puddles in general. Elias picked up his tools and moved to the next post. But he carried Samuel's observation with him for the rest of the day. The particular weight of something said plainly, by someone who hadn't learned yet to dress things up. Vivienne came out of her 2 days of preparation looking like someone who had been through something but had come out with what they went in for. There were shadows under her eyes, and she had refilled the inkwell twice, and the kitchen table had been covered in papers that she organized and reorganized into a specific order that only she fully understood. Clara had helped for part of it, copying figures in her careful handwriting while Vivienne cross-referenced and composed, and by the end Clara looked like she had attended a compressed course in something she had not known existed before. You ready? Elias said on the morning they were to go into town. Vivienne was at the mirror by the door, putting her hat on with the precise movements of someone who understood that appearance was its own kind of language. She had worn the green dress. He noticed and did not comment. She noticed him noticing. Today requires a different kind of conversation, she said, by way of explanation. She had her leather folder under one arm thicker now than it had been on the day they went to the bank, the first time considerably thicker. The papers inside it organized with index tabs that Clara had cut from heavy paper stock. They left the children with instructions and drove into Dustfield in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was serious. The way silence is serious when two people are about to do something that cannot be undone. The plan was not what Elias had expected. He had expected the bank, Pruitt's office, the dark wood paneling, the portrait of someone important. He had been steeling himself for that room. But Vivienne drove past the bank. The meeting hall, she said before he could ask. He looked at her. The public hall. I sent notes yesterday. Through Ada Fenwick and through Hargrove's boy and through the Sutter place. She kept her eyes on the road. Anyone who's been affected by the supply price situation, and anyone who's done business with the Callaway grain buyer, and anyone who has had dealings with the bank that felt irregular. Ada helped identify them. 13 operations in total. You called a meeting, Elias said. I invited people to have a conversation, she said. There's a difference, is there? In terms of whether people show up, yes, she said. People don't go to meetings. They go to conversations. He was quiet for a moment. And if no one comes, then we go to Pruitt's office and have a smaller conversation, she said. And it's harder. But we go. 8 of the 13 came. Elias had not known what to expect, whether people would be curious or reluctant or hostile or some combination of all three. What he found was 8 men and 2 women seated in the meeting hall's wooden chairs in the particular careful posture of people who have agreed to be somewhere without entirely committing to whatever is going to happen once they're there. Walt Greer was not among them. Neither was anyone he recognized as being in Pike's direct orbit. The Fenwicks were there, Ada in the front row with her husband beside her. Old Hargrove, who had driven in from his East County operation, despite being 71 and not moving quickly, was there. Sutter was there, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with the hollow eyes of someone who had been losing sleep to money problems for too long. Elias stood at the front of the room because it was his county and his situation, and he understood that Vivienne needed him visible in this in a way that mattered. But he kept it short. You all know why the bank's been able to squeeze people out here, he said. Or you've suspected. We've got documentation now. Not rumors. Actual purchase records, actual price comparisons. Enough of a pattern that what it is becomes hard to argue with. He looked around the room. I'm going to let Vivienne walk you through it, because she put it together, and she knows it better than I do. He sat. There was a brief silence that had the texture of people recalibrating their expectations. Vivienne stood. She opened the leather folder, and she was precise and methodical, and she did not dramatize any of it. She did not need to. She put the supply price records on the table at the front copies she had made, organized chronologically, cross-referenced by ranch, and she walked through the pattern the way she would walk through an account ledger, item by item, with the numbers visible to anyone who wanted to look. The room was quiet in a way that rooms are quiet when people are genuinely listening, rather than just waiting. The pattern is consistent over 22 months, she said. Prices across 5 categories of supplies increased in coordinated windows that do not correspond to regional market movements or documented transport cost changes. The increases are between 11 and 19% above what the market data supports. The operations most affected are the ones that carry existing debt, because a sustained cost increase on a marginal operation with debt is not just inconvenient, it's cumulative. It accelerates the timeline to insolvency. Sutter leaned forward. Who's coordinating it? The supply contracts all trace back to 2 intermediary merchants who are both exclusively capitalized by a single private investment account registered in Pratt County, Vivienne said. She set a specific page on the table. That account belongs to Judson Pike. The room was very quiet. Hargrove, who had been listening with his hands on his knees and his eyes half closed in the way of a man who is paying more attention than he appears to be, said, You can document that. I can document the financial connection, Vivienne said. A territorial court would be able to follow the remainder. The connection between the supply intermediaries and Pike's account is in the business registry records. Those are public documents. I sent for copies 3 weeks ago. You sent for them 3 weeks ago, Fenwick said. I identified the pattern 5 weeks ago, she said. I spent 2 weeks verifying it before I started collecting the documentation. Fenwick looked at his wife. Ada's expression said she had known this was coming and had decided it was right. Sutter looked at Elias. Your bank letter's part of the same system, Elias said. They're trying to call my loan before harvest, so I can't use the crop income to settle it. If I lose the property, Pike buys it at what he's been paying for the other places. Below value. He did the same thing to Colbert, a woman in the back said. Elias recognized her as the Colbert widow, who had moved into town after her husband's operation was foreclosed. She had come without anyone explicitly inviting her, which meant word had traveled further than Vivienne's notes. Colbert's loan was called 6 weeks before his harvest. 6 weeks. He had a crop in the ground that would have covered the debt, and he never got to sell it. The room absorbed this. "What do we do?" Sutter said. He was asking both of them, but he was looking at Vivienne. "The documentation I have is enough to raise formal questions with the Territorial Land Office about the foreclosure practices," Vivienne said. "It's enough to request a review of the bank's loan calling procedures. It's not a guarantee of any particular outcome. Courts move slowly and they don't always move right." She looked around the room. "But it puts the information somewhere it can't be ignored. Right now, Pike's system works because each of you has been dealing with it alone. Alone, any one of you looks like an individual operation having individual problems. Together, you look like what you actually are, a community, being systematically squeezed by one man who's been using the bank and the supply chain to manufacture a monopoly on this county's land." There was another silence. Then Hargrove said, "I've got purchase records going back 4 years. "I'd like copies," Vivienne said. "You'll have them," he said. It was not unanimous. 2 of the 8 left without committing to anything, men who were frightened enough by Pike's reach that the prospect of being named in any formal complaint felt more dangerous than the slow bleed of staying quiet. Elias understood that and didn't blame them. Fear was not a moral failure when the thing you feared was real and had already destroyed people you knew. But 6 stayed. 6 sets of purchase records, 6 operations willing to put their documentation alongside the Boone ranches in whatever formal complaint Vivienne was building. Sutter, who had a brother-in-law who had studied law in Wichita before coming back to the county to run cattle, said he'd ask about the mechanics of filing with the land office. When the last of them had gone, Elias and Vivienne stood in the empty meeting hall with the paper spread on the table between them and the afternoon light coming through the high windows at a low angle. "That was more than I expected," he said. "It was enough," she said. She was already gathering the papers back into the folder, careful with the order. "Now we go to the bank." He looked at her. "Today." "Today," she said. "While the meeting is still something that just happened, and before Pike hears about it and has time to move." Pruitt's office was as Elias remembered it. The dark wood, the desk, the portrait. Pruitt himself looked up when they came in with the expression of a man who had been expecting them but had not expected them today, which meant someone had been watching the meeting hall and had gotten word to him, but not word of what had been in the folder. Vivienne did not sit. She opened the folder on Pruitt's desk, and she set documents on it with the same methodical precision she had used in the meeting hall. The supply price records, the intermediary business connections, the registration documents from Pratt County, the copies of the Colbert loan timeline obtained through the county records office, where such things were technically public, preliminary crop contract with Callaway, signed 2 days prior with a per-bushel price and a delivery date. Pruitt looked at the papers. He did not touch them immediately. "The loan provision you cited in your letter," Vivienne said, "is not present in the restructured agreement as originally issued. We have the original documents. The provision either was added after the agreement was signed, or it is being applied in a manner that was not disclosed at the time of signing. Either of those constitutes an irregular banking practice that the Territorial Banking Authority reviews." She set one more page on the desk. "The crop contract represents documented future income sufficient to retire the loan balance in full at harvest. A bank that calls a solvent loan with a documented repayment path, in circumstances that happen to benefit a specific outside party, is a bank that the Territorial Authority examines closely." Pruitt's hands were flat on the desk. His face was careful. "Miss Harcourt," he started. "The question in front of you is a simple one," she said. "You can honor the restructured agreement as originally issued, accept the crop contract as demonstration of solvency, and allow the Boone Ranch to carry the loan to harvest and pay it in full. Or you can proceed with the loan call, and I will file a formal complaint with the Territorial Banking Authority that includes this documentation, along with a companion filing with the Land Office regarding the supply price manipulation that the same interested party has been running across this county for the better part of 2 years. Pruitt looked at the papers on his desk. He looked at Elias. Elias said, "I've got no interest in making trouble for anyone who's not making trouble for me and mine, Harlan. But I've got a crop in the ground and 3 children to feed, and I am not going to let someone take what we've built because it's become inconvenient for his land-buying plans." Pruitt was quiet for a long time, long enough that Elias became aware of the clock on the wall and the sound of the street outside, and the particular kind of tension that exists when a man is deciding which way a thing is going to fall. I'll need to review the loan documentation, Pruitt said finally. Of course, Vivienne said. We'll expect a written response within the week. She gathered the documents that were hers, leaving copies of the key items, and closed the folder and walked out. Elias followed her. He did not look back at Pruitt. On the sidewalk outside, he exhaled. He's going to call Pike, Elias said. He's going to call Pike and tell him that the documentation exists and that we've been to the meeting hall, Vivienne said. And Pike is going to understand that the system he's been running quietly has been made visible. She walked toward the wagon with her folder under her arm and her green dress moving in the afternoon wind. That's what we needed to accomplish today. You think he'll back off? I think he'll consider what it costs him to keep pushing against people who now have documentation in each other, she said. A man like Pike chose this county because it was manageable. Invisible. We've made it less invisible. He helped her up to the wagon. She settled her folder on her lap and straightened her hat. You wore the green dress, he said. Today required it, she said. He climbed up and took the reins. You were right about the dress the first time, too. At the bank. When you wore the blue one, she glanced at him. Different room, she said. Different message. What was the message today? At the road ahead. That I am not going anywhere, she said. And that I arrived here with resources that are not going to be intimidated out of being used. He looked at her profile for a moment before he turned back to the road. Vivienne. What? I want to say something, and I don't want you to be practical about it for a minute. She was quiet. When you came here, he said, I was certain you'd leave. Not because I thought badly of you, because I thought that badly of what I had to offer. He kept his eyes on the road. I've been wrong about that assumption for a while now, and I haven't said so directly. I'm saying it now. She did not say anything immediately. The wagon moved along the road, and the town fell behind them, and the open land came in on both sides with the late afternoon light spreading across it. You're not what I expected either, she said finally. What did you expect? A man with his hand out, she said, willing to accept whatever arrangement got him out of difficulty. She was looking at the road too, both of them looking forward. You've never once treated this like an arrangement. It's not an arrangement, he said. No, she said. It's not. They rode home with the sun behind them and the ranch ahead, and Clara was in the yard when they pulled in, shading her eyes against the light, waiting to see what they had brought back from town. And Elias looked at his daughter standing in the yard of the unfinished ranch that was slowly becoming something, and he thought, this is what you defend. Not abstract things. Not pride or property in the legal sense. This particular yard, these particular people, this specific and improbable life that had required the right kind of stranger to show up on the right platform and not get back on the train. He told Clara the basics while he unhitched Creed. She listened with her arms crossed and her face carefully neutral until he got to the part about the meeting hall and the 6 ranchers who had stayed. And then something moved in her expression that was not quite a smile but was the internal version of one. The documentation was enough, she said. It was enough to move things, Vivienne said. She had come around the wagon and was standing beside Clara. We don't know yet how they move. But they move, Clara said. Yes, Vivienne said. They move. Clara looked at her for a moment, with the evaluating, precise gaze that she had inherited from somewhere that was not entirely Elias. You put that together in 2 days, she said. The copies and the comparison tables and the cross-references. You helped, Vivienne said. I copied figures, Clara said. You knew what figures to ask for. You knew which figures meant something before I explained why, Vivienne said. That's not copying, that's understanding. Clara absorbed this without visible reaction, but her ears went the particular shade of red that meant something had landed. She went back to the house without further comment. Elias watched her go. She's going to be something, he said. She already is something, Vivienne said. She just doesn't know yet what to call it. The response from Pruitt's office came in 4 days, not 7. It was brief, and it was not an apology. Pruitt was not the kind of man who issued apologies, but it confirmed that following a review of the loan documentation, the bank was prepared to honor the restructured agreement as originally issued and would not be proceeding with the accelerated payment demand, pending confirmation of the crop delivery contract. Elias read it at the kitchen table with Samuel and Rose looking on, and Clara standing in the doorway with her arms folded. He set the letter down. It worked, Samuel said. It moved, Vivienne said from across the table. That's the same thing, Samuel said. Not always, Vivienne said. But today, yes, today it's the same thing. Rose, who had been sitting quietly with her chin in her hand, said, "Is Mr. Pike going to stop now?" The table was quiet. Elias looked at Vivienne. Vivienne looked at Rose with the directness she always brought to the child's questions, which was one of the things Rose had come to rely on. "Probably not completely," Vivienne said. "Men like Mr. Pike don't stop because they've been shown to be wrong. They stop because what they're trying to do becomes more costly than what they'd gain from it. So we have to keep making it cost him," Rose said. Another small silence. "Yes," Vivienne said, "that's it exactly." Rose nodded once with the gravity of a 6-year-old who has processed a complex situation and reached an accurate conclusion, and then asked if there was any cornbread left from supper. And the kitchen moved back into the ordinary sounds of a family in a house at the end of a day that had been harder than it had to be and had ended better than it might have. Outside, the wheat was still growing. Still getting there by the slow increments of things that were alive and working, indifferent to Judson Pike and Harlan Pruitt and the whole apparatus of pressure that had been aimed at this particular piece of Kansas land, growing because the ground was there and the seed was in it, and the season had not run out yet. The wheat came in during the second week of July, and it was not a miracle. Elias needed to be clear about that with himself, standing at the edge of the eastern field on the morning they began cutting, because he had a human tendency, kind you develop after enough hard years, to retroactively reshape difficult things into stories that made more sense than they actually had. The wheat was not a miracle. It was the result of a late planting and a compromised seed variety and 11 days of uncertainty after the storm and daily walks along the rows watching for disease and drainage problems and the dozen other quiet disasters that could take a crop before it was ever a crop. It was the result of Vivienne's decision at the supply merchant that he had initially questioned. It was the result of the channel he had cut through the low spot to fix the drainage, and the 3 mornings he had gotten up before light to check on it in the weeks after the hail. It was work. It was documented, planned, argued over, worried about work, and it had produced a yield that was below what the original seed variety would have produced in an ideal season and was still enough. Not abundantly enough. Not extravagantly enough. The Callaway buyer's man arrived on the 3rd day of cutting, a compact and efficient man named Reese, who walked the rows with a practiced eye and made notes on a small pad and confirmed the quantity against the contract with the brisk satisfaction of someone whose job was to verify things and who had found them verifiable. "You're within the contracted range," Reese said, which was the most straightforwardly good sentence Elias had heard in months. "By how much?" Vivienne said. She was standing beside Elias in the field, her boots muddy, her hair less than entirely controlled by its pins. "You'll come in about 8% under the high estimate," Reese said, "but comfortably above the floor. Payment processes within 10 days of delivery." After Reese left, Elias stood in the field for a long moment. Samuel appeared at his elbow. "Is 8% under bad?" "No," Elias said. "Is it good?" "It's enough," Elias said. Samuel thought about this. "Vivienne says that a lot." "Enough. She's usually right when she says it." "I know." Samuel shaded his eyes and looked at the cut rows. "I helped plant this." "You did," Elias said. "I didn't think it was going to work," Samuel admitted. "When we planted late, I thought it was done." Elias looked at his son. "Neither did I," he said honestly. "Not completely." Samuel nodded with the solemnity of someone who appreciates honesty more than reassurance. "But it did, Elias said. "Not the way we planned." "But it did." The payment from Callaway came in 9 days rather than 10, which was the kind of small, unremarkable mercy that Elias had learned to notice and not overlook. He took the bank draft to Dustfield Savings and Loan on a Tuesday morning, alone, without Vivienne, because this particular errand he needed to do himself. He needed to stand in Pruitt's office and put the draft on the desk and watch the man record the payment against the loan balance with his own eyes. Pruitt was professional about it. He had been professional about everything since the day Vivienne had laid the documentation on his desk, in the careful, contained way of a man who has understood that a situation has changed and has adjusted accordingly without admitting that any adjustment was necessary. Processed the payment. He provided the receipt. He confirmed the revised outstanding balance, which was now a number Elias could manage, could see the end of, could carry without it, pressing the breath out of him at 2 in the morning. At the door, Pruitt said, Your wife is a capable woman, Mr. Boone. Elias stopped. She's not my wife yet, he said. But she is. He walked out into the July heat and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the receipt in his hand, and he thought about the word yet, which he had said without planning to, and which turned out to be the most honest thing he had said all morning. Judson Pike's situation did not collapse overnight. That was not how these things went, and Vivienne had been careful throughout never to promise anyone that they would. What happened was slower and less dramatic, and more real than a collapse. It was more like a tide going out. The way the tide goes out and reveals what's actually on the bottom when the water has been covering it. Sutter filed the formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office in late July, with his brother-in-law's legal assistance and the supply price documentation attached. Hargrove filed a companion complaint 2 weeks later. The land office sent an examiner to Dustfield in August, a thin, unhurried man from the territorial capital who spent 4 days reviewing records at the county courthouse and asking questions of people who were, for the first time, not answering those questions in isolation. Pike did not immediately lose everything. That would have been a satisfying story, the kind where the villain's tower falls in a single dramatic moment, and life was not that kind of story. What happened instead was that the examiner's preliminary findings confirmed what the documentation showed: coordinated supply pricing through intermediaries connected to a single private account, and recommended a full territorial audit of the related business entities. That audit would take months. The outcome was not guaranteed. But the information was now in a system that was larger than Dustfield, larger than Pruitt's office, larger than the informal agreements that had let Pike operate as he had for years. And in the meantime, something else happened that was in some ways more immediately significant than any official proceeding. Talked. Not the way rumors traveled in Dustfield, sideways and deniable and shaped by whoever was doing the most reshaping. They talked in the direct way people talk when they have understood something they were previously confused about, and the understanding is both a relief and an anger. Sutter told 3 other ranchers what the documentation had shown. Those ranchers told their neighbors. The Colbert widow, who had been living in town for 2 years with the suppressed bitterness of a woman who knew something wrong had happened to her family and had not been able to name it, named it at the dry goods store on a Wednesday afternoon, with a directness that left the 3 other women in the room, silent for a long moment before they started asking questions. Walt Greer came to the Boone Ranch on a Saturday morning in August, unannounced, which was how he had come before, but with a completely different posture. He had no horse between himself and Elias this time. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who has spent some time deciding whether to come and has decided to come and is not entirely at peace with the decision. Elias, he said. Elias was at the water trough, working on the pump mechanism that had been intermittently difficult all summer. He looked up. Walt turned his hat slowly in his hands. I said some things a while back that they weren't fair. What I said about your wife. About her taking control of things. She's not my wife yet, Elias said. Right. Well, Walt looked at the hat. I was carrying Pike's water, and I knew I was, and I told myself it was just neighborly concern, and it wasn't. And I'm sorry for it. Elias looked at him for a moment. He thought about the things Walt had said, and the way he'd said them, the careful delivery of someone else's message dressed up as concern. He thought about what it had cost Vivienne to walk into that meeting hall and stand in front of 8 people who might not have come and lay out the documentation piece by piece, and what it would have cost her to do it if the Walt Greers of the county had been more effective at the work Pike had given them. I appreciate you saying so, Elias said, which was not the same as it's all right, but it was what was honest. Walt nodded. He put his hat back on. Pike's been telling people the land office thing will go nowhere, he said. That he's got connections in the capital. He might, Elias said. We'll see. Yeah. Walt looked at the ground. For what it's worth, most of the people he's been saying that to aren't believing him the way they would have 6 months ago. He left. Elias went back to the pump and found that Vivienne was standing in the doorway of the house, which meant she had seen most of it. You were civil, she said when he came inside. He came and said the thing, Elias said. That takes something. It does, she agreed. Doesn't mean everything he said before is nothing, he said. But it takes something to come and say it. She was looking at him with the expression she used for things she was thinking about carefully. You're a fair man, she said. More than you give yourself credit for. I'm trying to be, he said, most days. The question of the ceremony came up on a Tuesday evening in early September, in the way things came up between them sideways, without announcement, emerging from the middle of a conversation that had been about something else. They had been talking about the back room, the unfinished portion of the house that Elias had been framing out for 2 years. The barn repair had given him a better sense of what a complete structural job required, and he had been making notes on what it would take: materials, time, whether Corbett was available for part of it. Vivienne had been looking at the notes and doing the cost arithmetic in the margin with the automatic reflexiveness of someone for whom numbers were a native language. "If we do the framing in October before the cold sets in," she said, "the interior work can go through the winter." "That's the plan," he said. "It'll need to be properly planned as a room," she said. "Not just framed and left." "I know that. What's it going to be?" He looked at her. "Whatever you want it to be," he said. "It's your house, too." She set down the pencil. She looked at him directly, the way she had looked at him on the train platform the day she arrived, assessing, steady, not flinching from what she was looking at. "Is it?" she said. He understood the question. It was not really about the room. "I was going to ask you," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to ask you properly." "There's no properly," she said. "Just asking." He sat across from her at the kitchen table, where they had sat together for most of the important conversations of the past 8 months, with the ledgers and the receipts and the loan documents and the seed catalogs between them at various times, and he thought about how much of a life could be conducted at a kitchen table if the right person was sitting on the other side of it. "Will you marry me?" he said, "actually formally with whatever ceremony you want, not because of the property or the children or the situation, because I don't want to keep doing this particular life with anyone else." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. It came out the same way her important words always came out, without decoration, without performance, just the thing itself. "I'll marry you." Clara, who had been in the back room and had clearly been listening through the thin partition wall, made a sound that was not quite identifiable but definitely existed. "Clara," Elias said. A pause. "I wasn't listening," Clara said. "You were absolutely listening," Elias said. Another pause. "The answer was yes," Clara said. That was the right answer. And then the sound of her moving away from the partition with what was probably meant to be a casual dignity. Vivienne looked at Elias across the table. Something in her face was different, not softer exactly, but more present, the way a room looks different when a window that has been shut for a long time is finally opened. "Your daughter," she said. "I know," he said. "She's going to be something impossible to prepare for," she said. "She already is," he said. "I've been unprepared for her for 12 years. They were married in October, before the cold came properly, in a small ceremony at the county courthouse, with Sutter and Ada Fenwick as witnesses, because they were the people who had sat in the meeting hall and stayed. And staying mattered to Elias in a way he could not have explained clearly, but did not need to explain to anyone who had been paying attention. Samuel wore a clean shirt and his good boots, and spent most of the ceremony looking at the courthouse ceiling, with an expression of scientific interest in its construction. Rose held a bunch of dried grasses that she had assembled herself from the field's edge with great seriousness, because she had decided that flowers were required, and this was what was available in October. Clara stood beside Vivienne with the straight-backed composure of someone who was not going to cry in a public building and was succeeding by a small margin. The justice of the peace was a comfortable, unhurried man who had married a lot of frontier couples and had learned to recognize the ones who meant it. When it was done, and Elias and Vivienne were standing on the courthouse steps in the October light, with the Fenwicks shaking hands and Samuel already partway down the steps toward something more interesting than a ceremony, Elias held Vivienne's hand and thought that this moment was not the beginning of anything. The beginning had been months ago, on a train platform, when she had crouched down in her fine green dress and looked at Rose directly and said, "I'm not in a hurry." Everything since had been the marriage. The certificate was just the county's way of catching up to what was already true. Rose pressed her dried grasses into Vivienne's hands and then wrapped both arms around Vivienne's waist in the sudden, whole-body way she had of expressing things she didn't have words for yet. Vivienne put her free arm around her and stood there on the courthouse steps, holding Elias's hand on one side and Rose on the other, and the October wind moved through Dustfield with the particular clarity of autumn air. And the ranch was 3 miles away, And it was not finished, and it was not safe in any absolute sense, and the loan was not fully retired, and Judson Pike had not been brought to any final accounting yet, and the winter was coming, and there was. Always, in a life like this, another winter coming. None of that was resolved the way stories sometimes resolved things, in clean and final ways that left nothing outstanding. But what was true was also true, and it was this. Elias Boone had written an honest letter to a stranger, and the stranger had written back with equal honesty, and they had each understood something that a lot of people never got to understand, which was the difference between waiting for a life to become what you want and building it into what it needs to be. The territorial audit of Pike's business entities concluded the following spring. The findings were what the documentation had suggested. They would be coordinated pricing through controlled intermediaries, a pattern of strategically timed financial pressure on indebted small operations. 2 instances of what the auditor's report has described as irregular bank coordination that the Territorial Attorney's Office determined warranted further review. Pike did not go to prison. The law in 1884 was not always fast or complete in its reach, but the 2 supply intermediaries lost their operating licenses. The bank's relationship with the territorial authority became considerably more supervised. Pike's ability to move quietly through the county's financial arteries to apply invisible pressure through invisible channels was finished, because the channels were now visible to people who were no longer isolated with their confusion. He still owned his land. He still ran his cattle operation. But he ran it in a county where people had compared notes, and comparison had consequences. Sutter told Elias in the spring, when the news came through, that Pike had ridden into Dustfield the week. The audit findings were published and had gone to the feed store and the bank and the post office in the same order he always went, and that no one had treated him with any particular hostility. People were civil, because this was a county of people who valued civility, but something was different. He knows that everyone knows, Sutter said, and that's not a thing that goes back in the bottle. Elias told Vivienne that evening. She was at the kitchen table with Clara, who at 13 had progressed from copying Vivienne's figures to generating her own analysis of the household accounts with a thoroughness that had made Vivienne stop one afternoon and say, with complete sincerity, that she was genuinely uncertain which of them had the better natural instinct for financial pattern recognition, which was the most extravagant compliment Clara had ever received and the one she would remember longest. Vivienne listened to what Elias reported about Pike. She did not say, "I told you so," because she was not that kind of person, and also because it was not exactly what she had told him that worried men made mistakes, and that visible problems were harder to maintain than invisible ones. And the outcome was consistent with that, which was satisfying in the particular way that things being consistent with the truth was satisfying. "What does Pike do now?" Clara said. She asked the question with the genuine curiosity of someone who was interested in the mechanics of how people operated when their operating conditions changed. "He adjusts," Vivienne said, "or he doesn't. That's his problem to have, not ours." Clara nodded. She went back to her columns. The back room was finished by March. Corbett had done the framing in October, as planned, and the interior work had gone through the winter not every day, not fast, but steadily, the way the things that mattered most on the ranch got done, by the accumulation of effort over time rather than any single dramatic push. It became Clara's room. She had been sharing with Rose since the beginning, and she had not complained about this, because complaining was not in her nature. But when Elias told her the back room was hers, she went and stood in it alone for about 10 minutes before she came back out, with the expression of someone who has processed something privately and is prepared to proceed. "Thank you," she said to both of them. "You've earned it," Vivienne said. "You've more than earned it," Elias said. Clara looked between them. "Stop," she said, but not unkindly. Rose inherited the larger portion of the room they had shared, which she accepted with the equanimity of someone who had gotten good at accepting things as they actually were, rather than fearing what they might become. At 6 going on 7, Rose had developed the particular combination of practicality and fierce loyalty that seemed to be the household's default product, as though the family's circumstances had been the kind of environment in which those qualities either developed or broke, and in the Boone children they had developed. Samuel, who had broken his arm at 7 falling off the barn roof and had walked into hailstorms to see what he could see through fence shutters, and had announced at age 9 that Vivienne was theirs the way Creed was. Theirs continued to be more or less exactly himself. He had started working the cattle with Elias in a way that was no longer the helpful trailing along of a child and was beginning to be the actual contribution of someone learning a trade. He was not interested in the accounts. He was not interested in the politics of what had happened with Pike or the mechanics of what Vivienne had done with the documentation. He was interested in the animals and the land and the physical daily, concrete work of keeping a ranch operating, and he was good at it in the instinctive way that some people are good at things that cannot be entirely taught. One afternoon in the spring, watching Samuel move a difficult heifer with a patience and a reading of the animal's behavior that Elias recognized as something he had not taught the boy, Elias turned to Vivienne, who had come out to the fence for the afternoon air, and said, "He's going to be a good rancher." "He already is," Vivienne said. "You sound like yourself," he said. "What does that mean?" "When I said Clara was going to be something, you said she already was." He rested his arms on the fence rail. "You do that. You correct the future tense." She looked at the field. "Because it's accurate," she said. "People are what they are while they're becoming it. You don't have to wait until they've arrived to see what's already there." He looked at her. "Is that what you did with us?" "Saw what was there before it had arrived." She was quiet for a moment. "I saw what could be there," she said. "I wasn't certain. I've never been certain about things that depend on other people. You can read a ledger and know the numbers don't lie. People are more variable. But you came anyway." "I came anyway," she said. "Some things are worth the variable." He took her hand on the fence rail, which was not a thing they did often and publicly, and she did not pull away, which was her version of the same thing. The ranch was not transformed in the way that the word transformation usually implied: sudden, complete, final. It was more that by the spring of the year after Vivienne arrived, it was recognizably different from what it had been when she stepped off the train in the green dress, and the difference was cumulative, built from 100 small decisions and a few large ones, and from the specific quality of attention that two people brought to something they had both decided was worth bringing their full attention to. The barn stood straight. The eastern field had a second season of wheat in the ground. The loan balance was a number with an end in sight. Clara had a room of her own and a facility with numbers that would take her somewhere. She did not yet know where, and Vivienne did not press her toward any particular destination, because Clara would know when she knew and not before. The neighbors who had whispered about the wealthy saint, Louis Bride, what she really wanted, what she was really doing, whether Elias was a fool or a lucky man or both, had mostly stopped whispering about those particular things. Not because people stopped gossiping in Dustfield, which they did not, but because the specific questions about Vivienne had been answered by the specific evidence of her, which was hard to argue with. Hattie Pierce, who had brought a folding chair to the train platform on the day Vivienne arrived, stopped Vivienne outside the dry goods store in April and said, with the directness of a woman who had decided to say a thing and was going to say it, "I misjudged you when you got here. I thought you were going to be a season, a novelty." "A lot of people did," Vivienne said. "Well," Hattie adjusted her basket on her arm. "You weren't." "No," Vivienne said. "Your husband runs a different operation than he did a year ago," Hattie said. "Not just the money, the whole thing. He carries himself different." Vivienne looked at her. He was already carrying himself. He was just doing it alone. Hattie looked at her for a moment and then made a small sound that was approximately a concession and moved along, which was about as much as Hattie Pierce offered anyone on the subject of being wrong about them. There were still hard days. The ranch was not finished in any sense that meant finished. There was always another fence, another season, another variable in the weather, or the market, or the animal that required response and adjustment. Elias and Vivienne argued sometimes, not badly but genuinely, about decisions and timing and money and the children, and neither of them was good at arguing gracefully. Elias went too quiet and Vivienne went too precise, too focused on the logic of her position, and not enough on the fact that the other person was also a human being with their own logic. They had to learn each other's difficult edges the way you learned difficult terrain, by moving through it more than once and paying attention. There was a night in February when the temperature dropped in a way that threatened the rootstock they had put in on the south side of the property, and they were both out in the dark trying to protect what could be protected, and it was cold and frustrating, and things were not going to be saved entirely. And at some point, Vivienne said something clipped, and Elias said something back that was not his best self, and they worked in silence for the rest of it. When they came in, cold and muddy and tired, neither of them said anything for a while. Then Elias said, "I'm sorry. What I said about the rootstock placement being your decision." "It was my decision," Vivienne said. "It was our decision," he said. "And the weather was not the decision's fault." She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her hands for a moment. "I should have asked rather than told on that one." "You usually ask," he said. "I was in a hurry," she said. "That's not a good reason." "No," he said, "but it's a real one." They sat at the table in the cold kitchen, waiting for the stove to do its work, two imperfect people who had chosen each other with open eyes and were now doing the ongoing, unglamorous work of living up to that choice on ordinary days and bad weather nights. That was what it actually was. Not the dramatic version, with the villain's defeat and the harvest's triumph, though both of those things had happened and had mattered. The actual ongoing texture of it was this: a kitchen table, cold hands, an argument that ended without a winner, two people choosing to come back to the middle. Life on the frontier had a way of stripping the ornamental from things. It showed you what was actually load-bearing. And what Elias had learned, over the course of a year that had required more of him than he had known he had to give, was that the load-bearing things in a life were smaller and more ordinary than he would have previously thought, and more valuable. A woman who crouched down in her fine dress on a train platform to speak to a frightened 6-year-old at eye level. A man who fixed the fence in the dark after a bad day because the fence needed fixing. A daughter who kept a notebook. A son who understood animals. A little girl who stopped waiting for her mother to disappear. These were the things that held. Vivienne had come west, looking for a life that required something real from her. She had found it. The requirement had been harder than she expected, and different in its shape, and she had not gotten through it without making mistakes. Mistakes about timing, about communication, about the moments when Elias needed to lead, and she needed to follow, and she had not always seen those moments clearly. She was not the same woman who had gotten off the train. She was more worn at the edges and more certain of the things she was certain of, and less patient with pretense. And she had 3 children who were partly hers now, in a way that was not legal fiction and not sentimental claim, but the accumulated reality of a year of showing up. On a morning in late spring when the wheat was in the ground for the second time, and the barn was straight, and the eastern field showed the particular green of something that was going to be all right, Elias stood at the fence with Rose beside him. Rose had grown 2 inches over the winter, and was wearing a pair of boots that Vivienne had ordered from the catalog specifically for her, the first pair of boots she had ever owned that were not hand-me-downs from Samuel. They were looking at the field. "Vivienne said the wheat's going to come in better this year," Rose said. "She thinks so," Elias said. "The soil's better now that it's had a season." Rose nodded, her chin in her hands on the fence rail, studying the field, with the patient interest of a child who had been watching adults pay close attention to land for long enough that she had started doing it herself. "Papa," she said. "Yeah, I don't wait for her to leave anymore." He looked down at her. "I know," he said. "I forgot I used to," she said. "I was trying to remember this morning when I started to forget." She squinted at the field. "I think it was around winter, when she was up at midnight with the papers. I thought if she was going to leave, she wouldn't be up at midnight about it." "That's good thinking," Elias said. Rose shrugged, modest about her own insight. "She's not a guest anymore," she said. "Guests don't stay up about things." The poor rancher had expected his wealthy bride to walk away. He had written an honest letter because he did not know how to write a dishonest one, and she had answered it because she recognized honesty the way people recognize a sound they have been listening for, without knowing it. She had walked into an unfinished house and an unfinished life, and she had not tried to finish it for him. She had sat down at the table and opened the ledgers and asked, "What are we working with, and what are we working toward?" The answer, it turned out, was each other, and 3 children, and a barn that stood straight, and a field that was going to be all right. Not perfectly, not finally, not without the next hard winter coming, the way hard winters always came on the Kansas frontier, indifferent to whether you were ready. But not alone. That was the thing that made the difference between surviving and building something worth surviving for. Not alone.